Cradle of Filth. Probably one of the many reasons that we're right now embridled in a generation of spooky kids. Nah, I'm not trying to label anybody out there, nor am I really trying to label the band as responsible, because let's face it, there are plenty of other reasons why children of this generation are acting a certain way. And I'm not even here to talk about children from this generation. I'll reserve that for one of my rant videos, which you guys all seem to really like, so I'm going to keep making them. Coverkillernation, though, there is a new Cradle of Filth album, which was just in time for Halloween this past Tuesday. Of course, the only Halloween trick-or-treat chicanery I got to take part in this year was the trick-or-treat of Hurricane Sandy. Yippee-ki-yay, that fucking blew. But anyway, MANTICORE and the Other Horrors, the newest album from Cradle of Filth. And if you remember, a couple of years ago, whenever I did the review for Darkly Darkly Venus et Versa, their last album from 2010, I wasn't too heavy on it. I wasn't exactly the happiest of campers with the release. I didn't necessarily call it a bad album, but I wasn't necessarily thrilled with it. And you will remember that I called it better than the Dimmu Borgir offering from that same year, which I still hold to be extremely and totally true. But here with MANTICORE and Other Horrors, it seems like Cradle has turned a little bit of a corner. They themselves stated that they didn't want to do the same thing that they had done with their previous two albums. And, well, who could really blame them? Whenever you continuously do the same thing over and over again, there tends to be, well, people like me that pick up on it and start to realize that there's kind of that simulacrum that I always talk about that exists from one album to another. And that tends to be a problem. So what they decided to do with this album, they decided to make it a series of different horror stories, or, different collections of beasts of legend and those that they themselves created, and basically based an album around a collection of stories. Of course, Dani Filth is one of the premier and probably one of the most decorated wordsmiths in all of metal right now. It's to the point where the dictionary might have to redefine wordsmith to Dani Filth. And that's something that a lot of people have always treasured about his work. He's very much the Lovecraftian of heavy metal right now in the way in which he writes, even though he does blend in a little bit of the Edgar Allan Poe and the William Shakespeare to create one big amalgamation of dark and macabre what-the-fuckery. With this album, though, it's something that, well, it was a pleasant surprise for me. See, I've been a fan of Cradle of Filth before, and before I kind of soured a little bit on them whenever I realized they became a little bit samey, well, there's one thing I always kind of thirsted for, one thing I always zested for. I kind of didn't like the fact that they were taking more of a mainstream thrashy approach with their blackened style of metal, and, well, on this album they seem to return to, well, those older days just a little bit. Now, this is not a full 180 turn where they're kind of deciding to turn back the clock and stay there for good. No, the modern expectations and the modernisms of their sounds still remain. However, whenever you listen to this album as compared to perhaps Darkly Darkly or Godspeed on the Devil's Thunder, you're not hearing as much of that sound that you've heard throughout the course of the 2000s that has kind of devolved, so to speak, from albums such as Midian and Cruelty of the Beast. Instead, with this album, you're hearing a little bit more of a turn back the clock to establish a little bit of some of the same tones that you heard on Cruelty and the Beast and Midian, just to name two as an example. So, with their incorporation of this into their already pre-existing semi-thrashy sound, what's the makeup actually create? It actually creates a fantastic environment. The environment that it really kind of embodies is one of the modern, as well as one with the very kind of romantic but very depraved side that they've always been able to, kind of toss in there from time to time. But now you're starting to get back those memories, those floods of memories from back in the day whenever this was really something that sounded a little unique. It wasn't something that you heard every day and out of every metal band. It wasn't something that multitudes of projects around the globe were trying to really use as their way of distributing their metal product. Instead, Cradle of Filth, once again, kind of has that sound of something very unique. That sound of something that's, well, been kind of a long time coming, kind of long forgotten by some people, and, well, I'm not sure if some people actually remember Cradle this way. Now, for the legions of fans out there that have no doubt done their homework and no doubt kind of gone back and turned back the clock themselves to review the past history of Cradle of Filth, well, most cases they'll tend to either say that the old stuff is supreme and nothing newer will touch it, myself included, or the newer fans or the younger fans, the spooky kids of the world, will tend to swear by the stuff that, well, they heard first. And can you really blame them? They heard it first. It's kind of like me saying that Brave New World isn't shit just because, well, it's the first album back for Iron Maiden with Bruce Dickinson back in 2000. And totally ignoring albums such as Seventh Son and Number of the Beast, which I actually, value a little bit higher. Just barely, though. No. Instead, what you're going to get these fans doing is kind of getting a little bit of an earful, kind of like an audio glimpse of Cradle of Filth's past, infused in that style that they've been able to incorporate now for about the past half to total decade. With that in mind, this is actually, for me, a kind of a welcome back for Cradle of Filth. I really loved the instrumental at the end of this. Sinfonia definitely harkens back for me, considering I'm a member of the Phi Mu Alpha Sinfonia, which, obviously has nothing to do with it or anything like that, so there's no sort of joyous revelation there, but it's just kind of a neat little coincidence. However, with the remainder of the tracks, I'm very solid and very happy with it. Of course, Dani Filth's vocal heroics and over-the-top aerobic sort of exercise that he's able to do with these various voices that he's able to concoct, I mean, really that alone gives him all the reason in the world to brag about being a fantastic vocalist, because it's damn true. Well, it's still there. The thrashy style, the extremely dark, orchestrated influence, it's all still there. It's not something that's necessarily going to degrade just because they're trying to kind of shift back a little bit toward what they were maybe doing a little bit before the turn of the decade. And the turn of the century, should I say. It's really just a nice mix. The mix is actually what makes this album far more tolerable than its predecessor, but also probably one of the better Cradle of Filth albums to come out of the past decade. For that reason and that reason alone, I have to give this a high mark. I have to give this an 8.5 out of 10. Longtime Cradle of Filth fans will of course be very pleased with this, but I think it's even going to bring in some new fans and maybe even bring back some of those defectors that have decided, well, maybe it's time for me to try some Burzum. Probably will bring them back a little bit. So what do you guys think? Cradle of Filth. Band still worthy of talking about? Is this an album where it definitely feels as though they're trying to bring the past into the present? Or am I just full of shit? Tell me. Comments. Now. Do it. Like it. Subscribe. Ta-da!